All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of their grandchildren. May they be zochem eretz Hashem, to grow to become the best version of themselves. The shiurim this month are dedicated in the schos of refuah shalema for Yehuda Ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Clara Oxman. We hope that on the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And we thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Gobbie and Shayna Cohn, in memory of Gobbie's grandmother, Mrs. Clara Oxman, Chaya, Bas Chaim, Leib, HaLevi, Zichron Livracha. Again, we hope that on the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. With that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Mem, page 40. We are actually picking up in Yahrzeit Hashem at the last two dots on Lamed Tes Amud Beis 39b, right at two dots. Ones Sho Seba Tzitza. So yesterday we began a really fascinating Mishnah where we began, actually the last couple of Mishnayos have begun to contrast the halachos concerning ones and mefata, the one who goes ahead and violates a woman versus the one who goes ahead and seduces a woman. And we begin to gone through methodically the differences in these two different sets of halachas. So in the last statement of the previous Mishnah, the Mishnah said one of the fundamental distinctions was that in the case of mefata, in the case ultimately of the seducer, everyone involved has a right to refuse the marriage. Even again, the perpetrator himself, the man, has a right to say, I don't want to marry this woman. And again, certainly the woman has the right to say, I don't want to marry this man. And the father of the girl has the ability to object to the marriage as well. This stands in contradistinction to the case of ones. In the case of the violator, halacha l'maisa, when a man violates a woman, he has a biblical obligation to go ahead and marry her. And the truth is, if she wants to marry her father, the father of the girl wants her to marry, then the actual perpetrator himself has no right of refusal. This is what the Mishnah called shoseb ba'atzitzo. He drinks from his pot. In other words, that lemaisa, he committed the crime, and therefore halacha lemaisa, he is obligated to go and marry this woman, no matter what her particular circumstances. Says the Gemara, Amrli Rava, last line on Lamitas Days, last line 39b. Amrli Rava mi Parzakya l'Rav Ashi. So Rava Parzakya said to Rav Ashi, Michti migmar gamri mehadadi. You know what I'll say? It's interesting. The Gemara says we learn out a lot of the halachos of ones and mefata one from the other. In fact, if you take a look at the last Rashi on the daf, Rashi says migmar gamri mehadadi. Ones mimefata l'shkalim. So, for example, we learn out the concept that ones, the penalty payment of ones, we learn it out from mefata, that just like mefata you pay in shkalim. Shkalim is like highest level currency. So too for ones you pay in mefata. Or mefata me ones lechamishim. And we learn out that the same way you pay 50 shkalim. For ones, you also pay for mefata. So the point the Gemara is making over here is, we learn out a lot of these halachas one from the other. If that's the case, top of mem, laha milsa nami ligmura mehadadi. Why don't you go ahead and learn out this particular thing one from the other as well? Meaning what? That the same way that in the case of ones, in the case of a man who violates a woman, the perpetrator is forced to go ahead and marry his victim. Why don't we say the same thing in the case of seduction as well? To which the Gemara says, Amar B'kra, because the pasuk says, Mahar maharena lo liisha. Because I'll say, interestingly enough, the Torah says, by the case of seduction, Mahar maharena lo liisha, that ultimately, again, she will be to him as a wife, lo midaito. The word lo ultimately means that what? With his consent. Okay, so essentially the Gemara answers, it's based on a pasuk. Based on the pasuk itself, makes a fundamental distinction between ones and mefata, which is very interesting. Because what we begin to see is as follows. It's often there's an association between these two halachas of ones and mefata. And what becomes clear as we go through this sugya is whereas there are certain similarities, right? But there are many more distinctions. The similarities really seem to be halacha l'maisa in the realm of the age of the woman impacted, or the age of the woman who these halachas affect, and number two, the nature of the penalty payment. But in every other area, halacha l'maisa, they're fundamentally distinct. And herein lies one of the most fundamental distinctions, that by the case of mefata, the seducer, everyone involved, like I said before, has the right of refusal to this marriage, including the perpetrator. Whereas in ones, in the case of the man who violates the woman, part of his punishment is that he is forced to marry her, assuming again that she and her father consent. Okay, credible. Kate's son, Shosabat Tzitzo. So we'll say, so remember again, the Mishnah then ended off in saying there is one exception to this rule. In other words, so the Mishnah said, in the case of the man who violates the woman, he drinks from the pot, right? Which means that whatever the nature of this woman is, so the Gemara says, if she's crippled, she's blind, she's covered with boils, whatever it is, Lamaisa, if he violated her, he's obligated to marry her. There's one exception to the rule. What's the one exception to the rule? If she is the kind of woman who is asura to him. For example, the example we gave in yesterday's daf was, Ruvain violates Rachel, and Rachel is a mamzeres. She's a mamzeres. So now, the marriage to her would be something that is biblically prohibited. So halacha l'maisa, that would be a case where, although the Torah says that the man who violates the woman, the perpetrator, must marry his victim, halacha l'maisa, in a case where marriage is usher, he wouldn't be obligated to do so. So the Gemara says, Amrav Kahana, Amrisa l'shmaita kamed Rav Zvid min Arda. I said over this ruling in front of Rav Zvid of Narda, and he asked the following, Nesi asay v'nitchalos asay. Wow. I will say, listen to this. Rav Zvid of Narda said, I don't understand. Halacha l'maisa, there's an asay and a los asay. Right? For example, so right, the asay over here is mahari marana lo l'isha. Ultimately, again, the asay, well, that's by ones. That's by mefata. Right? By ones, the Torah says, halacha l'maisa, he's obligated to marry her. Right? So we have an asay that the perpetrator is obligated to marry his victim. Now I have a lo saseh. What's the lo saseh? Lo yovo mamzer bekal Hashem. It's not allowed to marry I'm using mamzer as an example. You're not allowed to marry a mamzer. So in halach we have a principle of asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. We have a concept like this, that a positive commandment could come and set aside a prohibition. So, or I should say not set aside, but what's the right word? Override. Thank you. Override. So why don't you say the same thing over here? Let the positive commandment of the perpetrator marrying his victim go ahead and override the prohibition of marrying a mamzeres. So we'll say, this is incredible. Amarli, he responded to me, it's a good point, but it's a misuse of the concept. When do we say that an asay should be docha lo saseh? I will say, when do we say that a positive commandment overrides a prohibition? That's kigon mila bitzaras. I will say, this is an incredible case. A paradigmatic case of asay docha lo saseh, I will say, is as follows. If a person has something on his skin, something on his body, that looks like tzaras, so there is an isur da'araisa to cut it off. In other words, you might say like this. You imagine the following situation. You have something that shows up on your skin, a little white spot that might be tzaras. What's the halacha? You have to go to the Kohen. So now it's Monday. I have plans to go on vacation. So I don't have time to go to the Kohen, nor do I really want to start getting into sequestering and seclusion. So I have a great chap. I'll just cut it off. Save me a little bit of time. So I'll say that is an isur da'araisa. There's isur da'araisa to cut off tzaras in order to avoid the process. So what about the following situation? Imagine an 8-day-old baby, B'sha'ah tova mitzlacha, so mazel tov to Ramat on the birth of a son this past Shabbos. Mazel tov. And he was here at Daf, by the way. Baby was born Friday night, he was here Shabbos afternoon. He also stayed for like 3 hours after Shir. I don't know, it was, right? Mazel tov, v'shvi zocha, la'achniso, l'briso sham avino bizmano, l'gal Torah l'chuppah, u'lemaisim tovim. Mazel tov. So this is not shaykh for your boy, but I'm saying so that's an interesting mila shaila. Let's say you have a baby boy who has some type of discoloration, some type of potential tzaras on the foreskin, on the makomila. See, here's the problem. I want to give the baby a bris milah. But now lemaisa, in order to give the baby a bris milah, I have to remove the tzaras. So I have an asay, a positive commandment of bris, a lo saseh, a prohibition of the removal of possible tzaras. So what do I do? So the Gemara says, that's asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. No, that's the case. That's the case where a positive commandment, i.e. bris milah, could come and override a prohibition of tsara'as removal. Why? Because Rabbi say, this is incredible. When do we say asi aseh v'docha lo saseh? When do we say that? When the only way to perform the positive commandment is through overriding the prohibition. That's when we say that the positive commandment comes and overrides the prohibition. Aval hacha, say, but you can't say that over here. No, remember, what's the Shayla? The Shayla is Reuven violated Rachel's mamzeres. So why don't we say that asi aseh v'docha lo saseh, the positive commandment for the perpetrator to marry the victim, should override the prohibition to marry a mamzeres? Why don't we say that in this case? To which the Gemara says, no, aval hacha. In this case, if Rachel were to say, I don't want to marry Reuven at all, so what would be the halacha? What would be the halacha? There's no marriage. In other words, what the Gemara is saying over here is as follows. When do we say asi aseh v'docha lo saseh, that a positive commandment overrides the prohibition? When the only way to perform the positive commandment is through the overriding of the prohibition. So that's the case of you have to give the baby a bris milah. The only way to give the baby a bris milah is to remove the potential sara'as lesion. So that's when we say asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. Over here, in this case, I will say, there is a possibility that the aseh never even comes to fruition. How so? By the girl saying, Rachel saying, I don't want to marry this guy. So because the performance of the aseh is not an inevitable fact, therefore we don't say asi aseh v'docha lo saseh. Or in other words, the only time we say that a positive commandment overrides a prohibition is when the fulfillment of the positive commandment is an unavoidable reality. Then the aseh is docha the lo saseh. But if halacha l'maaseh, the performance of the aseh is not an unavoidable reality, like in this case, where the girl Rachel could say, I don't want to marry this guy, then we don't say that the aseh is docha the lo saseh. Incredible. I will say there's more to say about aseh docha lo saseh from a hashkafic perspective as well, but I'll save it for the end of this year. We'll get first through the daf. Says the Mishnah, Yisoma shenis arsa v'nis garsha. So we'll say another very interesting case. What about a Yisoma? And I will say what the case sounds like and what the case is are going to be two different things. But let's at least go with what it sounds like. A Yisoma is an orphan. Shenis arsa, who had erisin, and then ultimately again was divorced. What's talacha? Rabbi Lazar Omer ha'onis chayiv ma'mefate pater. Rabbi Lazar says that if a man violates her, he is chayiv to pay the knas, but if he seduces her, ultimately again he's pater from the knas. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Yisomashnis arsa v'nis garsha ha'onis chayiv ma'mefate pater kechayvan di yisomahi uknas shalohi va'achilta dimidaita nispasesalo pater. So I will say, just understand what's happening over here. Because she's a Yisoma, therefore, who gets to keep the knas in these type of situations? The girl herself gets to keep the knas. When there's no father, the knas comes to the girl. We're going to see that more explicitly in tomorrow's daf as well. But the knas comes to the girl. So I say this is actually very interesting. So in this case over here, if a man violates her, he's obligated to pay her the knas. If he seduces her, ultimately, he's not obligated to pay the knas. Why? Because seduction comes with the consent of this girl. Her consent essentially means that she forgives the penalty payment. You see, when there's a father in the picture, so even if the girl consented, the father did not, and therefore the father gets the penalty payment. But halacha l'maaseh, again, when there's no father in the picture, if she was violated, then there's a penalty payment. But halacha l'maaseh, if there was seduction comes with her consent, and therefore no penalty payment. So Rabbi Lazar Omer, good, fine. Amar Rabba, so he says that's the Mishnah. Amar Rabba Rabbi Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Amra. Rabbi Lazar, I will say this, by the way, the Rabbi Lazar being quoted over here is Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. He was one of after Rabbi Akiva, we saw in Yevamis, after Rabbi Akiva lost all of his Talmidim, he went, Ad Sheba, Eitz Rabbeinu Shebedarom, he comes to the rabbis in the south of Eretz Yisrael and establishes 5 new Talmidim. Amongst those, one of those 5 is this Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua. There's a lot of Rabbi Lazars in Shas, right? There's Rabbi Eliezer. So sometimes Rabbi Lazar could be Rabbi Lazar ben Aruch, and who was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And in this particular case, this is Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua, who was one of the 5 new Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. So the Rabbi comes along and says, Rabbi Achana says, and then Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar of the Mishnah, Beshitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Amra, is ultimately espousing the position of Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. What did Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe, say? The Amar, Yesh lo kinas, ukinasa liatzma. Because Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha lemaisa, a girl who does not have a father, she's still entitled to the knas, and she gets to keep the knas herself. Rabbi said, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Beshitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Amra, Daramas Nisin, Naroshinis Arsa Viniskarsha, Knasa Liatzma. Because Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that halacha lemaisa, once a girl has undergone erusin and has been divorced, so now she has personal autonomy. She's still entitled to the knas, but the knas no longer goes to her father; it goes to her. V'hachnis arsa v'niskarsha d'Rabbi Lazar k'shavia kayim the karila yisoma mishum depaka zuchus av mina lagabe knasa. Oh, this is very interesting. So the Gemara says Rabbi Lazar's position is predicated on his Rebbe's position, Rabbi Akiva's position. And what's Rabbi Akiva's position? That essentially, once a girl undergoes erusin, right? Once she undergoes erusin, she is removed from the domain of her father. Which means that if she undergoes erusin and is now divorced, and is, let's say, violated. So the halacha now is she is entitled to a knas, but who gets to keep the knas? Who gets to keep the knas? The girl herself. So I will say this is fascinating, because now what the Gemara essentially is saying is, the Mishnah called this girl, we're going to keep calling her Rachel, called this girl Rachel a Yisoma. We understood, we defined, what's a Yisoma? What's a Yisoma? An orphan. Orphan means what? No father. To which the Gemara is saying, by the way, that's not actually what orphan means. Orphan means she has a living father. Halachically, she's an orphan. Why? Because her father would not be entitled to any of these penalty payments. Why would her father not be entitled to the penalty payments? Because Rabbi Lazar is espousing the shita of his Rebbe, who holds that once a girl undergoes erusin, she is removed from the domain of her father. Father is no longer entitled to any of these penalty payments. She gets to keep them herself, and as such, we call her a yisoma. We call her an orphan, but in other words, they're calling her an orphan because an orphan is descriptive of her halachic right. It's as if she has no father, but her father can be very much alive. So the Gemara says itself, Mimai, mediktani yisoma. Rabbi Lazar omer ha'oni is chayiv, v'amefate pater. So because we said a yisoma, Rabbi Lazar said that ultimately, again, if a man violates her, he is obligated to pay the fine and she keeps the fine. But if he seduces her, ultimately, again, he's pater. So the Gemara says, Yisoma, if she's an orphan, pshita, elaha kamash malan, dinara shnis arsa v'niskarsha ki yisoma. The Mishnah is coming to teach us that a girl, a nara, who has had erusin and then gets divorced, is like an orphan. Namely what? Namely how? Ma yisoma liatzma, just like a yisoma gets to keep the penalty payment herself, afnara shnis arsa v'niskarsha liatzma, so too, a nara who had erusin and was then divorced also gets to keep her own penalty payments. So I will say, this is the shita of Rabbi Akiva, and now ultimately the shita of his student Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua, that once a na'ara undergoes erusin, now obviously I will say this is a case of where she had erusin and got divorced, right? Remember why? Because if she still had erusin and was violated by a man, then that's a case of adultery. So this is a case of where she had erusin and she was divorced. Rabbi Akiva and now his Talmud Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua hold that in a situation like that, she has left the domain of her father, and therefore halacha l'maisa, any penalty payments accrue to her. Now I will say that works both ways. So in a case of where she's violated, she'll keep the penalty payment. In a case of where she was seduced, what's going to be the halacha? No penalty payment. Why no penalty payment in that case? Because again, it has her consent. So because it has her consent, therefore no penalty payment. Very interesting. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Zera, Amar Bar Shila, Amar Hamnuna, Saba, Amar Ada Bar Ava, Amar Rav, Halacha, Kireba Lazar. The halacha follows Rabbi Lazar. So Rabbi said the Gemara seems to say over here that halacha l'maisa, we follow this din of Rabbi Lazar, namely again, which is the sheet of Rabbi Akiva, that once a nara undergoes erusin, she is removed from the domain of her father. She goes ahead and keeps any type of penalty payments herself, and she is called a yisoma, what we call a yisoma b'chaye aviha. She is considered to be an orphan with a living father. So the Gemara says, Kari Rav alei Rabbi Lazar, Tovina dechachimi. Ultimately, Rav said about Rabbi Lazar, he is called Tovina dechachimi. Ultimately, again, the most fortunate of the Chachamim. I will say, look at Rashi, it's actually Tovina dechachimi, mu'ushar shebechachamim. He is considered to be ultimately, again, one of the most praiseworthy, or the most fortunate amongst the Chachamim. So we'll say here, Rashi says, Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua, v'talmido d'Rabbi Akiva, ekidarmin b'yevamis, b'aval yevimto, v'ya olam shomim, atshava Rabbi Akiva, esra b'seinu shebedarim, v'shana lahem Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua. I will say, so it's interesting over here that it calls him Tovina dechachimi, the most fortunate of the Chachamim. I will say, what's fascinating about this is Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua going ahead and espousing anything new? Is he espousing anything new? Not at all. What is he doing? He's just simply relaying over the teachings of his Rebbe. So Rebbe will say it's interesting because yet the Gemara calls him Tovini dechachimi, like the most fortunate of the Chachamim. So I think the Gemara is teaching us a fascinating idea, which is sometimes we would assume that like the greatest accomplishment, let's say the greatest rabbinic accomplishment is innovation. That's the greatest accomplishment, right? If you could come up with a chiddush, come up with an idea, and you see that sometimes the greatest accomplishment in life is just being another link in the chain. So you don't need to be an innovator. You don't need to come up with chidushim. The ability to simply pass down the beautiful Torah Kedosha from one generation to the next. Imagine taking the same Torah of your Rebbe and just passing that down to your own Talmidim, to your own children. Sometimes that's the greatest accomplishment. Is there a place for innovation? Of course. And is innovation, is chiddush important? Absolutely. But again, sometimes the ability just to take that which belonged to the previous generation and pass it down in its same form to the next generation, that is the hallmark of Judaic accomplishment. I'll point out, this is the midah of Yitzchak Avinu. If you look at Yitzchak, what did Yitzchak Avinu accomplish? Right? If you open up Bereshis and you go through and you want to know, what did Yitzchak Avinu do? I know what Avram Avinu did. Avram Avinu was Lech Lecha, 10 Nisyonos, 10 tests. I understand Yaakov, right? Yaakov had a crazy life. A whole episode. Esav, Lavan, Yosef, all crazy stuff. What did Yitzchak do? Let's say if you look at Yitzchak, the stories of Yitzchak Avinu's life are mirror images of Avram Avinu's life. Mirror images. Whatever Yitzchak, right? Avram endured famine, Yitzchak endured famine. Avram dug wells, Yitzchak dug wells. There is absolutely no innovation in Yitzchak Avinu's life narrative. And says Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, that's exactly the point. Yitzchak Avinu's entire life mission was to solidify the spiritual edifice built by his father. Yitzchak was not supposed to be an innovator. Yitzchak was not to be a mechadesh. Yitzchak was to be a solidifier. And Rav Hirsch says, innovators get a lot of attention. But he says the world can't exist without solidifiers. And Avram Avinu was an innovator. Yaakov Avinu was an innovator. Innovators are great, but without solidifiers in the middle, innovators, what they build ultimately falls apart. So I will say it's such an incredible yisod that at the end of the day, here you have Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua called the Tovina dechachimi. What is he doing in this sugya? All he's doing is simply conveying that which his Rebbe said. So Rebbe will say it's important for us to build and important for us to be mechadesh, but so much of success in our Yiddishkeit is taking what we've received from previous generations and handing it down in its same form to our children and future generations as well. Good to be an innovator, just as important to be a solidifier. Says the Mishnah, Ezu Boshes. So we'll say, remember again, one of the things we've seen is that halacha l'maisa, in addition to the penalty payment, both by the ones and the mefata, is what? Is halacha l'maisa a payment of boshes. What's boshes? Humiliation. Humiliation. So says the Mishnah, Ezu boshes. What's boshes? Hakol lefi hamavayesh v'hamisbayesh. Now here's what's interesting. Boshes is a subjective payment. Subjective payment. Because boshes depends on your station. On your station. So when it comes to measuring boshes, it depends on who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. Who is the victim? Rashi says over here, Adam Benoni Hamavayish Boshto Kasha, Adam Zolam, Adam Chashav. Someone who is very important has a heightened level of boshes. Someone who is relatively unknown has a lower level of boshes. Pigam, what's pigam? Depreciation. Rowan Osakili Shifcha Nimkeres B'Shuk. We'll say, how do you measure depreciation? That's interesting. We see the girl who's the victim as if she was a maidservant being sold on the market. Kama haisa yafa v'kama hi yafa. How much was she worth? In other words, we'll say if she were to be sold as a maidservant, right? How much would a maidservant be sold what would her value be before being violated or after being violated? I will say, in the Gemara is going to ask, I don't understand what being violated or not being violated has to do with being a shifcha. The Gemara will ask that, but Lamai said that I want to point out, it's not necessarily the pshat. We don't necessarily look at this girl, the victim herself, and say if Rachel were to be sold as a maidservant. Rather, again, what we look at is in general, is if a maidservant, how much would she be sold for prior to the incident versus after the incident? Knas, what about knas? Shava b'chal adam. We also say knas, what the Mishnah is pointing out over here is boshes and pegam are subjective payments. Knas is a fixed amount. The Rebbe will say that's what makes a knas a knas. A knas is a fixed amount, totally independent of your personalistic circumstances. Versus halacha l'maisa, versus mamon. These are restitutional payments. That depends on your personal circumstances. So the Gemara v'chol sheyesh lo kitzva min haTorah shava b'chol adam. We'll say any amount that's fixed applies to any person independent of their personal circumstances. Good. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara ve'ema chamishim slam am rachmana mikol mili. We'll say, I'm going to ask an interesting question. How do you know that? So let's take the case of Onis, right? A man, Reuven violates Rachel. Torah tells us that he has to pay her 50 shkalim. How do I know that? Why don't they just say that maybe that 50 shekel payment is all inclusive? In other words, how do you know that there's pigam, that there's boshes? Maybe there's one payment, and the 50 shekel payment includes everything. To which the Gemara says, Amar Bizera Yomru Ba Bas Melochem Chamishim, Ba Bas Hadyotos Chamishim. Does that make sense? If Rachel, tell me, were to be royalty, and let's say, does it make sense that a girl of royalty and a girl of a regular family would get the same level of damages for an act of violation? It doesn't make sense. At the end of the day, the impact of the crime is felt differently on different people. So it can't be that there's just one payment. In other words, you could tell me that there's a knas, and the knas, the penalty payment at the end of the day, could be the same for everyone, but there's got to be some other type of payments that reflect the different subjective circumstances. Well, if that's the case, Gobbie Eved Nami. What about the following case? There's another halacha. If I have a shar, I have an ox, right? My ox goes ahead as a shor muah. Let's say it's a shor that's already been worn. My ox gores Ruvain's Eved Kanani, and kills Ruvain's Eved. What's the halacha, Rabosai? There's a penalty payment. What do I have to pay? 30 shkalim. 30 shkalim. Why don't they say the following? Ihachi Gobbie Eved Nami. Yomru Eved Nokev Margolio Shloshim. Eved Osemasa Amud Beis. Eved Osemasa Machat Shloshim. So let's analyze the following. So now there's 30 shekel that's paid for an ox goring an Eved. But let's say I have an Eved that is a skilled craftsman with dealing with jewels. And now let's say I have another Eved that just sews. So does it make sense that an Eved that is skilled with dealing with precious gems should be worth the same amount as an Eved that ultimately, again, just sows. Elamar Vizera, Ilu Bala Shnaim Echad Kidarka V'Echad Shelo Kidarka, Yomru Baal Shlema Chamishim Baal Paguma Chamishim. Simcha gives a more extreme example. Let's say a woman was violated by two different men, two different occasions. One Bia Kidarka, one Bia Shelo Kidarka. Does it make sense that the first and second men pay the same amounts? Amarli Abai Ihachi, Gobbie Eved Nami Yomru Ba'aved Bari Shloshim, Eved Muka Shchin Shloshim. I can say the same thing by Eved. Does it make sense that a healthy Eved should get 30 shekel? When we say the healthy Eved, the Avadim are dead. Talk about the masters. That if the ox gores a healthy Eved, he gets 30 shekalim, and if he gores an unhealthy Eved, he still gets 30 shekalim. Allah Amra Abayi Amrakra Tachas Asher Ina. So we'll say, here we go. Abayi says, you're right. We'll say, rather, the pasuk says, just to give you the pasuk in its entirety, V'nasan ha'ish ha'shochid ima la'avi ana'ara chamishim kesef v'lo sia le'isha tachas asher ina. We'll say, so the pasuk says, the perpetrator will pay the father of the victim 50 silver pieces, chamishim kesef, tachas asher ina, because he has violated her. So the Gemara says, Hani tachas asher ina. The 50 silver pieces is a penalty payment that is paid because he has violated her. And I will say, so what do you see from there? That's a penalty payment associated with the act of violation. Michlal di'ika boshes upegam. So I will say, by the fact, see, the Torah could have just said, he'll pay her 50 silver pieces. The fact that it says he'll pay her 50 silver pieces, tachas asher ina, associates that payment with the violation. But it also tells you that what? There are other payments. Right? Not knas payments. There are other damages. So I just want to point out something else. The penalty payment, I say, is what we call a knas. A knas is not damages. A knas is a penalty. So the Torah goes out of its way to say the 50 silver pieces, that is a penalty payment. But the fact that it identifies it as a penalty payment for the act of violating her tells us that what? There's still damages. The Rebbe will say, what are damages? Boshes, humiliation, is damages. Pegam, depreciation, that's damages. So therefore, Abai learns. If a Rava says, Amar Kra, V'nasan ha'ish ha'shochiv ima la'avi ha'nara chamishim kesef. The pasuk says, V'nasan ha'ish ha'shochiv ima. The man who slept with this girl, who violated this girl, will give the father 50 kesef, 50 silver pieces. Hanas shchiva nun, literally again, for the benefit that the perpetrator got from the act of relations, for that he has to pay a penalty payment of 50 silver pieces. Mechlal di'ika boshes upigam. Ultimately, it tells us, I will say, so essentially, Abayi and Rava are agreeing on the principle. They're just learning it out from two different parts of the pasuk. But ultimately, again, for the benefits, so to speak, that the perpetrator got, that's 50 silver pieces. But that doesn't preclude damages as well. Says the Gemara, the Ema lidida. So maybe I will say, why don't we say the following? Maybe since the Torah says that the penalty, so we'll say, so here's what we've identified. We've identified is that there is a penalty payment of 50 silver pieces. That we've identified. But the fact that the Torah associates the penalty payment with the act of violation tells us that there are also other payments to be made in the form of damages. Which damages specifically? Which damages? Boshes and pegam. Now we'll say, now remember again, there is a third pocket of damages, right? What's the third pocket of damages? Tsar. Well, remember again, we're not bringing up tsar over here. Why? Because tsar only applies in one of the two cases, right? Tsar only applies by the case of ones, not by the case of mafuta. That was yesterday's daf. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ve'ema ledida. The Gemara asks an interesting question. Maybe, why don't we say like this? Maybe the penalty payment goes to the father, and who gets boshes and pegam? Who gets boshes and pegam? Maybe the girl herself should get boshes and pegam. Maybe that's also the distinction in like the payments over here. Father gets the knas. They both say the fact that the father gets the knas, okay, that's explicit in the pasuk. Maybe the girl should get the other damages, boshes and pegam. So the Gemara says, Amar Kra binu areha beis aviha. The pasuk says, it's interesting. The pasuk says, both sides. This pasuk, by the way, is a totally different context. The Gemara is going to bring that up in just a moment. But the pasuk says, "Benuareha beis avia," which the Gemara darshans to mean kol shavach nuareha la'avia, which means literally when she is a na'ara, she is in the house of her father. Which the Gemara now understands to mean that when she is a na'ara, her father gets all of her earnings, so to speak, right? Whatever she accrues ultimately comes to her father. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So therefore, again, before we go on, therefore, even though there's Boshes and Pegam, the Boshes and Pegam will go to Rachel's father as well. How do you know that if the girl generates any type of income, any type of earnings, that it goes to her father? The pasuk says, if a man will sell his daughter as a maidservant, just as a maidservant, her earnings go to her master. Ultimately, again, a daughter, her earnings also go to her father. Says the Gemara, why do I need this drasha? Why don't you learn out from the previous drasha we just said? We just said Benuareha Beisavia, which teaches us that when she is a Na'ara, she is fully in her father, so her father has full rights. Elahi, you're right, the Gemara says, no, because the phrase of Benuareha Beisaviha, Rabbi say, is a different context. What is that referring to? Elahi Ba'afaras Nedarim Hu Dichsiv. So Rabbi say, Benuareha Beisavia is not talking about earnings, Maisei Adayim, or damages. What is it talking about? It's talking about Haparas Nadarim, annulment of vows. And when it means that when she is a Nara, she is still in her father's home, and her father has the right of annulment. So the Gemara says, so maybe you'll say, well, we should learn out the same way that a father has the right of annulment over his daughter's Nidarim when she's a Nara, so too he's entitled to any of her earnings or damages, to which the Gemara says, no. Mamona mi'isura lo yalfinon. Rabbi say, the ability for a father to annul his na'ara daughter's vows, that's a din in Isser. That's a din in Isser prohibition. We don't learn out mamon, monetary law, from Isser. V'chitema ne'elef miknasa. Why learn from knas? And say the same way that the father is entitled, ultimately again, to the knas of his daughter, he's also entitled to keep the damages, boshes and pegam, that she earns, to which the Gemara says, mamon miknasa lo yalfinon. We don't learn out mamon from knas either. Ela mistabra da'avia havi di by masala lamenuval umukashchin. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Rather, the Gemara says, how do you know that the father is entitled to her boshes and pegam? Rabbi say this is fascinating. So how do you know? So Rabbi say, let's go with what I do know. Here's what I know: is it halacha l'maisa when Ruvain violates Rachel? So Rabbi say there's a number of different payments, right? Payment number one is what? Payment number one, knas. And by the way, now we also begin to fill in like a lot of the blanks as well. There's knas. Remember again, in the case of ones, knas is paid immediately. We saw yesterday's daf. Knas is paid immediately. And knas is paid to who? Paid to who? Paid to the father. How do I know that? Pasuk. Right? That's easy. That's just a straight out pasuk. Okay. Now what we're also introduced to is, in addition to knas, there's also other payments. What are the other payments? Again, we've got boshes, humiliation, pigam, depreciation, and of course, by the case of ones, we also have what? Tsar. What we're trying to figure out about say is what? Who gets those payments? So I will say, so now we've unsuccessfully tried to go ahead and figure out where ultimately who gets those payments. Which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. The father gets the payments. And how do I know the father gets the payments? Listen to this fascinating idea. Because we'll say father has the right to go ahead and marry off his daughter until she becomes a bogeres, right? And if he wanted to, he can marry her off to who? To whoever he wants, to a menovel, to a mokashchin, which literally means he can marry her off to like the most disgusting, despicable guy, either physically repulsive or anything, which tells you what? Now imagine, right, Rachel's father were to marry her off to a mukashchin, a guy covered in boils. So what would that do to her? That would be terribly embarrassing. So I will say, so what do you see from? Yet the father still has the ability to do so, which means the father controls his daughter's boshes, and he controls her pegam. So the ability to marry her off to whoever he chooses indicates that he controls these aspects of her life. So the same way that he controls ultimately who he can marry off to, therefore again, he's also entitled to the boshes and pegam payments as well. So therefore, it turns out that in these cases, the father is not only entitled to the knas, right, the penalty payment, he's also entitled to keep damages. Now, I will say, we did see the one exception to this rule would be if the girl had erusin and was then divorced, according to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, that would remove her from her domain, from his domain. But assuming that's not the situation right now, halacha l'maaseh, it turns out the father is getting all of the payments, both the penalty as well as damages. Next, pigam rono sakili shivcha mikeres. So we'll say, remember again, depreciation. How do you go ahead and gauge depreciation? We view her as if we look at a shivcha. Difference between a shivcha who's a basula versus a shivcha who's not a basula. To which the Gemara says, Heichi shaymin Allah. How do we evaluate this? Amar Avu Dishmo Omdin Kama Adam Rotze Litain Ben Shivcha Basula the Shivcha Ba'ula L'Shamsho. How much would a person pay? What would be the price difference between purchasing a shivcha who's a basula versus a shivcha who's not a basula in order to serve him in his home? To which the Gemara says, Shivcha Ba'ula L'Shamsho Mai Nafka Lemine. They'll say, who cares? In other words, if I'm purchasing a shivcha to go ahead and be part of my domestic help, I don't understand what does it matter if she's a basula or she's a ba'ula? How does that impact her ability to work in the house? Ella, here's the difference between shivcha ba'ula, shivcha she'ena ba'ula, la sil la avdo. We'll say here's the difference. Remember again, I said if I purchase a shivcha, remember again, I have the ability to give her to my eved, It's not quote unquote as a wife. I mean, it could be for marriage, but it's not a bona fide marriage. So the Gemara says, "Avdo my nafkalamina." So to my eved, what can it matter? The eved sheish lo rabo koras rachemenu. So I guess it would be in the times of old that if the master had an eved who he had a particular affinity to, it was more chashuv to give that eved a shivcha who was a basula as a wife, versus a shivcha who was a ba'ula as a wife. So therefore, again, a person would pay a premium, so to speak, for a shivcha who was a basula, not because a shivcha who is a basula provides better domestic help, but because a shivcha who is a basula could ultimately, again, be a more suitable spouse for an eved, for my eved. So the difference in value that a person would pay for a shivcha who's a basula versus a shivcha who's a ba'ula, ultimately, again, that would be the difference. That would be pegam. That would be depreciation. Okay, says the Mishnah. Kol makom sheyesh mecher in knas, v'chol makom sheyesh knas in mecher. We've actually had this Mishnah beforehand. We've actually seen this before, but we'll just mention it now here as well. Any place where I would say any situation where the father has the right to sell his daughter, there is no knas. In any situation where the father has the ability to go, where there is knas, where there is a penalty payment, father doesn't have the ability to go ahead and sell his daughter. Ultimately, again, if he has the ability to sell it, there's no knas. Kitana, yesh lamecher ve'ein l'knas. Well, so now the Mishnah illustrates this. For example, a kitana, a father has the right to sell his daughter who is a ketana, right? He could sell her as a shivcha, he could sell her as a maidservant. So when she could be sold, ultimately, again, there is no knas payment. Nara, on the flip side, a nara, yesh la knas ve'ein la mecher. Ultimately, a nara, she has a knas, but there is no mecher, there is no sale. Can't sell a nara. V'abogeres, but a girl is a bogeres, ein la lo mecher ve'lo knas. Ultimately, once a girl's a bogeres, she's a full-fledged adult, and therefore, again, there's no mecher and there's no knas. So, say we actually saw this opinion. We saw this opinion of Rabbi Meir. We saw this opinion before, that Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, a father could sell his daughter when she's a ketana. But when she's a ketana, there is no din of knas. Once she becomes a nara, ultimately, again, he can no longer sell her, and that is where there is a din of knas. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav Zudiv Rabbi Meir. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chacham, on the other hand, hold that halacha l'maisa, there is the ability to go ahead and collect knas even when a father could go ahead and sell his daughter. So I will say, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop here for a day because I want to go back just to spend the last few moments on just ha'ara that we had something before. But again, we're leaving off with this fundamental machlokes on the timeline between mecher and kenas, and we'll see the resolution of this machlokes tomorrow. Both say we saw in the beginning of today's sugya the notion of asi aseh v'docha lo aseh. Right, so the Gemara wanted to know, why don't we say halacha l'maisa? Let us say docha lo aseh. And so even if a man goes ahead and violates a woman who is not permitted to marry, let the aseh, the biblical obligation of the violator, marrying his victim, be docha the lo aseh of, let's say in this case, of the girl marrying a mamzeras. And the Gemara gave its answer ultimately again about why that doesn't work. So I was very intrigued by the notion asi aseh v'docha lo aseh. A positive commandment could go ahead and set aside a prohibition. So Rabbi say there's much profundity to that concept, not just halachically, but hashkafically as well. What does asi aseh v'docha lo aseh mean? On a basic hashkafic level, what it teaches us is that halacha l'maisa, dynamic activity, is so much more important than inaction. An aseh, being a person who engages in dynamic activity, being a person who does, is the ikr so much more important than ultimately being a passive individual. But here's the problem with aseh docha lo aseh. And here's what's just intriguing about this idea, which is that halacha l'maisa, we have a concept of sur meira v'aseh tov. Right? So David HaMelech writes in Tehillim, sur meira v'aseh tov, which means to go ahead and avoid that which is negative in order that you can go ahead and do that which is positive. And the truth is, this becomes a model in spiritual growth. Often, we gravitate to the aseh tov rather than the sur meira. Right? Because think about it, it's so much easier to take on new things, so much easier to do more things than it is to go ahead and fix that which is broken. But David HaMelech says, here's the problem. If I don't address that which is broken, then you could do all the positive things in the world, but you don't really get traction. It's what Chazal call tovel v'sheretz biyado. Person immerses in the mikvah, but they're holding the sheretz, holding the dead rodent. So I'm going into the mikvah up and down, up and down, up and down. Incredible. There's only one problem. I'm still tameh. So when I have something that's broken inside of me, but I don't fix it, but I do a lot of great positive things. So I'm in the mikvah. The mikvah represents positivity, but I'm holding on to the thing that's broken. I can't get any life traction. So I will say, here's the shayla. How do these two things shtim with each other? Because on one hand, I have asi aseh v'docha lo aseh, and aseh is docha, which sounds like life is about positive dynamic activity, but yet I have sur meira v'aseh tov. So I will say, so which one is it? Do I have to fix that which is broken before I engage in dynamic activity? Or can I engage in dynamic activity and ultimately go ahead and what? Then push away the bad? And I will say the answer is, they're both correct. It's two different models of spiritual growth. There are times in life where David HaMelech's words are what I need. Sur meira v'aseh tov. I have to find the courage to identify what's broken inside of me. What's broken? What's misfiring? What's in a state of disrepair? Fix that first. Deal with that first. Sur meira. And then, once I go ahead and let go of my sheretz, then aseh tov. But I will say there are times in life where it's too difficult for me to deal with that which is broken inside of me. There are just times in life, and this happens all the time. Sometimes it's too painful. Sometimes I don't have the strength to deal with that which is broken yet. So what do I do in those situations? Asi aseh. I will say in that case, so bolster yourself with dynamic, positive energy. Do good things. And what will that do? That'll help you v'dochi lo aseh. That'll help you to rid yourself of the stuff that is broken. Sometimes I'm not ready to tackle my broken kite. Sometimes I'm not ready to tackle the things that are just not good inside. I can't deal with it now. Okay? Asi aseh, bolster yourself with dynamic, positive things. And that will help you to be docha your lo aseh. That'll help you to go ahead and push aside and rid yourself of the things that are negative and broken inside of you. two different models for personalistic, comprehensive, cathartic change. The ideal, which is Sur Me'ra V'Yaseh Tov, tackle that which is broken, and then move on to bolster your positivity. But sometimes when that model is not possible, Asiyaseh, do good things, take on new things, push yourself forward, and that'll give you the koach to be docha, your personalistic lo saseh. We'll stop here. Continue with the new sugya, or continue with finish up the old sugya and begin the new sugya tomorrow. Shkoyach.